Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to be here in Hungary because as I was kindly introduced, it is true that there are some similarities between Iceland and Hungary. Even if Iceland is very small, much smaller than Hungary, we are both nations that have had to fight against much bigger powers. And even if Hungary has been treated much worse than Iceland, because we are rather fortunate than our neighbors. Our neighbors are the Atlantic, and then Norway, Scotland, Canada, and the United States. Then we have occasionally been in the steps of the little island of Melos, when the bigger and stronger island of Athens, bigger and stronger city of Athens, were telling them that they had to surrender and they had to obey the Athenians in everything, like Thucydides say so well in the history of Peloponnese wars. My pleasure in being in Hungary is not diminished by the fact that when I was younger, I had a lot of debates with the Icelandic socialists and communists, and I usually ended my speeches with a poem from Sandor Petöfi, or if I would say it in Hungarian, it would be Petöfi Sandor, and it's an Icelandic translation. Upp nú líður, land þitt verðu, loks þér tvíkost, boðin sérðu, þjóðar frelsi, þrældóms helsi, þú sér munin, kjóstu frelsi. And I have actually been reciting this poem to a lot of my Hungarian friends, and they all recognize this. This is the exhortation by Petöfi on us having two choices. One is slavery and the other one is freedom, and we have to choose freedom, not slavery. So I looked it up actually when I came here, and it turns out that the nationalistic romantic poet in Iceland who translated Petöfi, he translated no less than 24 poems of Petöfi. Well, another reason I am pleased to be here is that I have a lot of good friends here, like John O'Sullivan, who just came to Iceland and gave a superb talk about Mrs. Thatcher called The Real Iron Lady. And here in the audience I have an old friend of mine, Antonio Martino. I used to know him when I was 20 years younger and 20 kilos lighter. But my subject here is Iceland and what really happened in Iceland in 2008. Because the whole world was astonished to see this small island with its banking sector totally collapsing. And there have been a lot of explanations floating around which I think do not bear scrutiny. One of them is, for example, that Iceland had a spectacular collapse. It turns out, as I will show, that it was no worse than in many other European countries. The second explanation or description is that the Icelandic banking sector was too big. But in fact it was no bigger than, for example, the banking sector in Switzerland, even in the United Kingdom or Belgium, and I will also show you that in our evidence. And then of course, logically, if you're a philosopher, does it make sense that you have a banking sector which is too big? Too big relative to what? Of course, the banking sector in the city of in London is too big if it would only be the banking sector that would have as its backer the region of Coventry, which is about the same population as Iceland. But it isn't if it has an insurance, institutional insurance area which is big. The third one is that the Icelandic bankers were reckless. Sure, they were reckless. But they were just as reckless as bankers were elsewhere, as we are now seeing much better than before. We were the first to have our problems, and people blamed it on greedy bankers, but we see that they are no less greedy, no more greedy than bankers are elsewhere. They are just about the same. And then people say, like Ha-Yun Chang, who wrote a bestseller called 23 Things About Capitalism That They Don't Tell You About, that Iceland had been liberalized and deregulated, and there was an experiment in neoliberalism in Iceland which miserably failed. But this is of course wrong, because the regulatory and the legal framework under which the Icelandic financial system worked was precisely the same as in other European countries. So that cannot be blamed really for the collapse of the Icelandic banking sector. My reading of the situation after the 5 years, after the dust has set, is that we had certainly systemic problems in Iceland, but into this rather weak and vulnerable situation entered crucial decisions from abroad. And I will try to tell you this story in those 25 to 30 minutes that are allocated to me. If we just look first at who were hit by the crisis, then we see that Latvia, and we used the rather plausible, I think, criterion of GDP contraction in 2009. Latvia was hit the worst, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Slovenia, Romania, Ireland, Iceland, and Hungary. So we see that 7 European countries were really hit harder by the financial crisis than Iceland was. However, of course, the collapse of the Icelandic banking sector was spectacular, so it was the big news for a while. Where we oversized, had we too big a banking sector, if we use this criterion, ratio of short-term liabilities to GDP, then we see that actually Belgium and Switzerland had larger banking sectors than Iceland, and United Kingdom a little smaller one. So if we use that criterion, were we more reckless than others? I think that the Icelandic bankers are pretty reckless, yes, sure. But so were bankers in other countries. As we have heard endless stories about, the Barclays Bank has been fined for fixing Libor rates, HSBC has been fined for money laundering, Goldman Sachs has been fined for misleading investors, and more importantly perhaps, several banks that we have looked up with with awe and respect, like in the Nordic countries Danske Bank, and in Switzerland Credit Suisse and UBS, they had to be bailed out. They were so reckless as to have to be bailed out, which puts the whole story about the Icelandic banks in quite a different perspective. And if we look at the currency swap agreements that the American Federal Reserve System made with banks abroad, then we see that essentially the American Fed allowed central banks outside the Eurozone almost unlimited possibility to print dollars. Everybody here knows that there is not a problem for a central bank to prop up the banking sector in its own country. They can just print their own currency, like we could print the krona, our currency, to save our banks. But we could not print dollars, so we couldn't help them with their foreign liabilities. Whereas the other Nordic countries, both Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, they made currency swap agreements with the United States, so they got a lot of dollars, and they used those dollars to save their banking sectors, which would otherwise have failed, like the Danske Bank. And there were enormous amounts of money drawn, not at the same time. This is the aggregate of the currency swap agreements. For example, the first currency swap agreement, which was announced with the Nordic countries, except Iceland, on the 24th of September, really sounded the death knell of Iceland, because the market saw very well that the Norwegian, the Danish, and the Swedish central banks, they got currency swap agreements, but the Icelanders were refused it. And that meant that there was no lender or last resort in Iceland, for dollars at least, dollar liabilities, but there was in the other countries. And you see here these immense amounts, $466 billion in Switzerland, $73 billion in Denmark. If we had just, in the aggregate, not at the same time, but if we had just got the same currency swap agreements per capita for a tiny little country, it would have meant $18 billion compared to Switzerland and $4.3 billion compared to Denmark. And as I pointed out, Iceland was regulated precisely the same way as the other EEA countries. It became a member of the European Economic Area in 1994, and the regulation had to be harmonized, so we just had the same regulations, same laws as the other EEA countries. The same reserve requirements and so on. So it was not because of a failed neoliberal experiment, as Ha-Jung says, that Iceland collapsed, or the Icelandic banking sector. However, it is true that there were extensive free market reforms in Iceland in 1991 to 2004. And we really changed Iceland from being one of the unfreest countries in Europe to being one of the freest countries in Europe. But I plead guilty to that charge, and I was quite involved in it, so I have a personal stake in the story. I just wanted to show you, here we have a little dinner party. Davíð Oddsson, my friend who was Prime Minister, myself and two of our friends, on the very day when the first government was formed on the 30th of April 1991, and we were determined young men. We wanted to liberalize Iceland, and so we did actually in the next 13 years. And what did we do from 1991 to 2004 in Iceland? We cut all corporate subsidies. Essentially, this meant that the waiting room of the Prime Minister was emptied. Before then, the Prime Minister had coffers of all kinds of regional funds that he distributed out to people to help companies that would otherwise go under. So we cut all those subsidies. Then we reduced taxes. I will show you in a graph, in the next graph, how immensely successful our tax reductions were, because essentially we maintained almost the same or even more revenue, but we cut the tax rates both for the personal income tax, and we abolished the wealth tax, and the tax system became a system of flat taxes. It was simple and productive. Then we privatized, and we used the money that we generated from the privatizations to pay up the public debt. So that when we left in 2004, there was no public debt in Iceland. And we stabilized the economy. The inflation was brought down to the same amount with the level that it was had in the neighboring countries. And we also developed further our system of in the fisheries. We have a system of individual transferable quotas in the fisheries. I've actually written a book about it in English, which is downloadable. It was published by the Institute of Economic Affairs in London, called Overfishing, the Icelandic Solution. Because Iceland is really the only European country that has a profitable and sustainable fishery. The common fisheries policy is a waste of money, totally contradictory and not functional at all. And that's one of the reasons the Icelanders are somewhat skeptical about the European Union. They see the losses and the danger to the fish stocks there, whereas we have managed our fish stocks properly, and that's by introducing private use rights that are transferable and permanent. We also made pension reforms, so our pension system became sustainable. We have the second strongest pension system in the world after the Netherlands. And we also reformed the public administration and the law on the right to information and so on. So the consequence of all this, these reforms from 1991 to 2004, was that Iceland in 2004, or rather in the first 4 years of the 21st century, enjoyed a very good reputation. And sometimes, as Hegel would put it, in a victory there are the seeds of defeat, and nature is cunning and dialectic, and that actually is the story I'm going to tell you. But first I'm just going to give you one graph, one illustration of our success with our tax reductions. We cut the corporate tax rate from 45 to 18%. But what happened? The revenue as a percentage of GDP went up, illustrating the fact that a smaller slice of a bigger cake can be bigger than a big slice of a small cake. And this is precisely what I noticed in Antonio Martino's eloquent speech here before. He was comparing Switzerland and Sweden, and I think that's an excellent comparison, also in terms of tax revenue. Because one of my favorite graphs that I showed to my audiences elsewhere, it shows that Sweden and Switzerland have roughly the same tax revenue per capita. I think the last figure was about $24,000. Same tax revenue per capita. The difference being that the tax rate in Sweden is between 25 and 30%, but in Switzerland, I mean, the tax rate in Switzerland is between 25 and 30%, but between 45 and 50% in Sweden. So you get the same amount of money with taxing about half. That's because the cake is much bigger in Switzerland, and that's because they have enjoyed low taxes and a stable political environment and a good protection of property rights over decades and centuries. So when we left office on the 15th of September 2004, we could look proudly back. It had been a very good time. There's no question about that. But here we see the success. And I think now that this was perhaps one of the explanations for the collapse of the economy, that we had such a high reputation after the reforms of 1991 to 2004 that we got AAA. Iceland got the AAA, and this of course was contagious, so that Icelandic companies and Icelandic banks and Icelandic corporations, everybody was trying to lend money to them. They had virtually unlimited access to money because of the trustworthiness that had been built up in the previous 13 or 14 years. And I'll show you now a stunning graph which illustrates what happened in Iceland. It is the development of external debt. Here you can see it. And you can see that the year 2004 is quite dramatic. It is after 2004 that the external debt, private debt, skyrocketed like this. It's just amazing to see what happened. But this is because of the almost AAA ratings that we had enjoyed and earned in the years before. So this is extraordinary to see this happening. And I have to tell you a story, because I think even if I was brought up by the Chicago economists in always trying to find systemic explanations for events in terms of costs, cost structures and prices and so on, there is also a question of personalities and motives and so on. And in Iceland there was a fierce battle for what I would call the intellectual hegemony in the early years of the 21st century. And essentially, we can divide therefore Iceland up into two periods. One was the period from 1991 to 2004, which was market capitalism. And that was competition, an independent judiciary, a free media, and economic power was separated from political power. And then there was a huge battle in 2004 for political and intellectual hegemony, and that was won by a clan called the Baugur clan, and the leader was Jón Ásgeir Jóhannesson, an Icelandic tycoon. It was, the battle about the media was only symbolic. I'm not going to go into that. It was a complicated thing, but essentially it meant that the tycoon, he won over Oddsson. And I believe that you can describe the years from 2004 to 2008 as crony capitalism, where the oligarchy, Jóhannesson, he owned the media, he was supported by politicians, and he supported them. And the judiciary was very mild. It was then as soft on the businessmen as it is now tough on them. I mean, both of it being unjust, they should just always be the same. So this is what happened in 2004. And we actually appointed a special investigation commission, like many others did. I listened with interest to your account, Mr. Wallason, of the inquiry into the causes of the crisis in the United States. We appointed an investigation, special investigation commission. It was flawed, the report of it, in that they only considered domestic factors, but it was very interesting what they found out. And what they did was to criticize the Icelandic Financial Supervisory Authority for not having connected companies, so that it systematically undervalued or underestimated risk. There was much more risk in the whole system than people realized, because there were essentially only 3 business groups that were intermingled there in Iceland, and they classified them, and it turned out that they were like this. This is the Baugur clan that took power in 2004, and then there are 2 others. But you see, the behavior of the 2 other business groups that were dominant in Iceland was much more moderate than that of the Baugur clan. and the guys who took power in 2004 and changed the economy from market capitalism to crony capitalism. And what did they do with their money? Well, they had a very good time, a luxury penthouse in Manhattan, and a private jet. This Jóhannesson, he actually marked his, both his yacht and his private jet with the numbers 101, and in papers in Iceland I say that's because the debts were on 100 corporations, but the real debtor was only one person, 101. Then a yacht as well. So they used some of the money for that, but of course also for all kinds of investments. So in Iceland, we had not only the international systemic risk that we have spoken about before here. The international systemic risk is, of course, the too big to be fail idea, and the subprime loans in the United States, which was explained very well to us. But also what Anna Swartz and others have said, it is a difficulty to price risk. I think essentially, if you look at the crisis, there are two main causes for the crisis. One is misguided government action, and then the inability to price risk. However, it is possible that this is inherent in the system. Because as Frank Knight pointed out in the 1920s and 30s, we have to make a distinction between a risk and uncertainty. And perhaps there is an all-pervading uncertainty that capitalism is just prone to. And if that is true, then my old friend, my mentor and Antonio Martino's teacher, Milton Friedman, wasn't quite right when he wrote a famous piece called Why Capitalism is Depression-Proof. Because if there is inherent uncertainty, besides the risk that we can try to price, then we just have to accept the fact that capitalism is subject to fluctuations, or as when Hayek was in his 20s, they called it business cycles. So here we are, that is the international situation. But in addition to those systemic risk factors in the international system, there were two Icelandic systemic risks. One of them was the one that I illustrated to you, which was that the loans in Iceland, they were basically the loans to the same person. They were on 100 ID numbers, but they were to the same person. So we had this underestimation of risk there, but then we had a second risk. And the second risk was that the banks, they had as their field of operations the whole of the European Economic Area, because that was what the European Economic Area was about. It was about an operational field consisting of the whole of Europe. But it turned out that our area of institutional support was only Iceland. At the time, it didn't occur to anyone because there had not been a bank failure. The first bank failure that people remembered was Northern Rock. So there had not been a bank failure, and everybody assumed that we would get help from other countries, and that there was a loose arrangement of lenders of last resort and so on, that we wouldn't be left alone. So this was a systemic risk, that the difference between the operational field and the field of institutional support. And this turned out to be our bane because there were three crucial decisions made abroad that entered into this weak, this frail, this vulnerable situation that we had in Iceland. One of them was the refusal of the American Fed to make currency swap agreements with Iceland, signaling to the market, as I said before, that we had no lender or last resort facility, which meant that Norway and Denmark and Sweden would be saved. But Iceland not. This was the first decision that entered into the situation on the 24th of September 2008. The second one was the decision by the Labour government, by Alistair Darling, to close two Icelandic banks in London 5 minutes before they presented the rescue package for all other banks in England, an immense rescue package. And the third decision was that of invoking the law on anti-terrorism against Icelandic banks. Iceland doesn't even have a military. And for months, this Icelandic bank, Landsbanki, was listed in the website of the British Treasury as being on a par with the Taliban's, with Al-Qaeda, and the governments of Sudan and North Korea. But you know, we may laugh at it now, but what it meant then, in the crucial days, in the beginning of October, was that all transfers to and from the country were stopped immediately, because people didn't make any difference in their minds between Landsbank and the other banks. The news was Iceland was on a list of terrorist organizations, hence cut all transfers to and from Iceland. And it was really only by only very closely that we sort of managed to get medicine and food and so on into the country for a while. Then slowly life got back, but we were basically cut off from the rest of the world by the imposition of the anti-terrorism law. This meant also, because we were brought down, we were struck down, we were on our knees, that there was a fire sale for a lot of our assets, or a lot of the assets of the banks. I would only, here show a few examples. I will only tell you about one of them. That's very interesting. Glitnir, one of the three Icelandic banks, had an affiliate in Norway called Glitnir Bank. And the insurance fund for investors and depositors, they made very harsh conditions on them so that they had to sell the bank immediately. And it was sold to a consortium of savings associations. The chairman of the consortium of savings associations which bought the bank also happened to be the chairman of the board of the insurance fund for depositors and investors. So it was sold for 1/10 of its real value, that bank. And there were a lot of other stories like this, so that the assets were reduced artificially in value, our assets, because we were brought down. So one wonders, whose fault is it? I believe actually that most things happen by unintended consequences. So there is no one culprit anywhere. But then you may argue in some ways that while the Icelandic banking sector was as weak as banking sectors elsewhere, the reason it collapsed was that it didn't receive any help, either from the Americans or from the British. They were not morally bound to give us that help, but they gave that help to a lot of other countries, like Switzerland, for example, and so on. Also, it may be that there was some hostility towards Iceland for the fact that the Icelandic banks, they were quite efficient. They were very computerized. They could offer better rates than other banks. They were the new kid on the block. They were upstarts. They were not the members of the establishment. As much as many others, and I think actually that was their great mistake, that they never ingrained themselves into British society, which was their main field of operations. You have really to obey the rules of the club. There are certain unwritten rules that lie in the air, especially in a tradition-bound country like the United Kingdom. Possibly there were also those who heeded the call of the OECD and the EU and didn't want any tax competition, because essentially what we engaged in the years before, in the years 1991 to 2004, was cutting corporate taxes in order to attract capital and corporations to Iceland. But tax competition of that kind, that the Isle of Man engages in, for example, is perhaps unpopular with the powers that be. And then when we try in Iceland to understand what it was that made the British refuse aid or help to the two Icelandic banks in England and invoke the anti-terrorist law against Iceland, it came out that way. There are several things that we notice. One is that there was a lingering suspicion somewhere that the Icelandic banks were funded by Russian mafia money. And I have information to the effect that MI5 investigated this in 2005, whether there was any Russian mafia money there. That turned out not to be. any. But that's an interesting little thing that has to be explored further. And then I read the extraordinary memoirs by Alistair Darling, and there he says, well, the Icelandic bankers, they came to London and they established their companies there, and they made a lot of profit and they became rich, and they donated a lot of money to the Conservative Party. And it so happens that I know almost all of them. They are not so many. We are a tiny nation. All of the bankers in London that are Icelandic, and I asked them, none of them actually, they are broadly conservative, all of them, or almost all of them, but none of them says that he or she has ever given any money to the Conservative Party. But this is in his memoirs, so it was strong in his mind. So there was some hostility there towards the Icelandic banks. Then I think Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling were under a lot of pressure because Labour-controlled boroughs and municipalities had kept a lot of their money in the ISAVE accounts that the Landsbanki had. So is it possible, and it's only a question that I am exploring myself at the moment, is it possible that Gordon Brown decided a Falklands effect without any cost or any risk, bringing down a tiny nation that couldn't defend itself and that was totally expendable? Good question. Others have to provide me with the answer. Then I was reminded this morning when I listened to all those excellent presentations and where people were discussing Lehman Brothers and whether it was a mistake. There was a high, because I was very close to Davíð Oddsson, who became governor of the central bank, and I was on the board of the central bank from 2001 to 2009. And on the 30th of July 2008, a high official in the financial world, he came to Iceland. He had been salmon fishing, and Davíð Oddsson invited him to a dinner. And this guy said, I can tell you what I think. I think we are going into very troubled times. This is the 30th of July 2008. And I think that the powers that be in the financial world are going to bring down one bank. And I predict that will be Lehman Brothers. And they will do it because they are under pressure not to heed to Wall Street, and they also want to send warning signals to other institutions that they have to behave. So I predict it will be Lehman Brothers. And I think also that one small nation will be brought down, and I predict that will be Iceland. And this high official in the financial world, he said this on the 30th of July 2008, only a few months before both of this happened. Interesting. Now, then the other story is a little bit different. IMF was brought in after the collapse of the Icelandic banks. And we didn't really need the IMF. After the collapse, we would have needed the IMF to prevent the collapse. So some of us didn't want to have anything to do with the IMF because we could look after our own house, so to speak. And the governor of the central bank, Davíð Oddsson, the former prime minister, he explained it to the IMF people. We don't need you. I mean, why should we take out a very huge loan from the IMF just to keep it in an account at the Federal Reserve Board in New York with enormous interests that we have to pay on it? Just to have currency reserves. We do not need any currency reserves anymore because we are down. There was a long conversation, and then the IMF representative said, you have to realize we have to live too. Because they were in the business of giving loans to governments that had failed. And so they did want us to be one of those governments because they wanted customers. So that was an interesting thing, and IMF played not a very distinguished role in the Icelandic debacle because they actually turned out to be then hand collectors for those who made claims on us. Then we come to what happened after the bank collapse. I have to explain to you, and perhaps I should do it with photographs, but I felt that I didn't have time to do that. The bank collapse came as an enormous shock to Iceland because we had been so wealthy, a flood with money, as you could see from the years before, that people thought that this was really the end of the world. And people had always conceived of themselves in Iceland as a country where nobody would happen to us, that we were sheltered away from the rest of the world. We were in a far and remote corner of the Atlantic. We were, however, prosperous and free like the other Nordic nations, and suddenly we didn't have any money to buy medicine and so on. So there was a huge shock. Those who supported capitalism were totally discredited in Iceland. I describe it this way. I used to go out, for people who have been in London, I used to go out to the Hyde Park corner and give my sermon there on one of the boxes, and I had a lot of audience there, and the people clapped after it. But suddenly, one day, I went on my box and started to give my speech. Nobody was listening. They were all listening to a speaker on another box. I was totally discredited as the spokesman for capitalism in Iceland for 2 or 3 years. And there was also a resort to street violence and so on because of this huge shock. So it really cost us much culturally. Now, what we did though, before the left-wing government took over in February 2009 is, we devalued the currency so the export industries could fuel a recovery. And this is a story in many countries, a story which wouldn't really make the euro attractive to adopt for countries that are going through such difficulties. And we distinguished between the good banks and the bad banks. That is to say, we saved the domestic part of the banking sector, and we did have the power to do so. We had the means to do so. And then the foreign sector was basically put into informal receivership. Not a formal one, but an informal one, with assets being sold on. But as a result of the shock, a very petty and vengeful left-wing government came into power in February 2009, and they brought the Prime Minister, not Davíð Oddsson, but the Prime Minister after him, Geir Haarde, to court, and that was a laughable verdict because he was actually acquitted of everything except he hadn't held enough ministerial meetings about the crisis, which is a kind of formal registered meetings. Davíð Oddsson was thrown out of the central bank and so on, and they tried to all kinds of constitutional changes, but then they ran into a lot of difficulties and they managed the economy rather badly. Although those things that we had done in the beginning, they began to show results. And the IMF, there was a dispute with the British and the Dutch, because the British had actually paid out to all depositors in the Icelandic banks money, and then they tried to collect that money from the Icelandic government. And our argument was that we were not liable for transactions between an Icelandic bank and their customers abroad. That's not really what we are liable for, and it would have been an enormous sum that we would have to pay, similar to the Versailles settlement of the Germans. And the deals were voted, that the left-wing government made, were voted down in 2 referenda, and then the EFTA court deemed it illegal, the claim by the British and the Dutch. So we won that battle against the left-wing government, which had made all those deals with the British and the Dutch. So that was, we said we shouldn't bail them out. And let me also stress here that I'm not saying that we should have been bailed out. I'm not really saying that we should have been helped by the American Fed or by the British government. But it is a little bit unfair to look at the Icelandic banks as being totally reckless or bad banks just because they were not saved. Whereas all the other banks were saved, and the mistakes made there, they were hidden. All the mistakes that the Icelandic banks committed were brought up in the open. So I'm just making that point. I think it was a blessing in disguise that we didn't bail out the banks, because then we would have been saddled with an enormous public debt like the Irish are. But that's a different story. I'm telling 2 different stories here. And I believe that there are rough waters ahead for Iceland. What happened was that because of its ineptitude, the hard left-wing government was voted out heavily. It had about 50% of the votes in the spring 2009 elections, but it went down to 25%. It's really the greatest defeat in the history of Iceland, the defeat of the petty, vengeful left-wing government that we had as a result of the bank collapse. And when we look at it, they didn't really cut public expenditure as it should have done. They made cosmetic changes. They postponed investments. What was good about the whole thing was the sharp devaluation, which enabled the exporting industries to fuel the recovery, but we didn't really bring things in order ourselves. We slowly recovered. We are now on a par on what we had in 2002 and 2003. So Iceland is not at all in very dire straits, but there are rough waters ahead. And the left-wing government tried, for example, to destroy the system of individual transferable quotas in the fisheries. And as the Wall Street Journal said in an editorial, that was really suicidal, because this is what Iceland is based on. Iceland is based on the fisheries, and then a little bit of electricity and tourism. So now we have a center-right government, and it's a little bit battle-scarred and cautious, this center-right government. They mean well, and I hope they are going to do something about cutting public expenditure and facing up to the facts, but they are quite cautious. They are not as hard on the whole thing and tough on it as we were on the 30th of April in 1991, I think. But I really hope the best for them. So, which are the lessons we can learn? I think I would like to say that we have two lessons. We have an international lesson to learn, but also an Icelandic one. The international lesson is that extensive regulation did not hinder the crisis. So when people ask for more of the same, then they are talking about failure. More of the same failed regulation. I think that if you have strict regulation of the financial sector, it creates false security, and also it creates uniformity, which in itself is an additional risk factor. Because if the composition of capital is the same as a result of financial regulation, then the risk is enhanced, not reduced by it. It is a subtle point that not all understand, but it is an extremely important one. It's much better for risk management to have many diverse compositions of capital in different companies. So the only realistic strategy for the world is tax cuts and economic growth. But what is the lesson for Iceland? What can we learn from it? And I think that may be something which is relevant to Hungary, although the situation is quite different because we are out in the Atlantic and you are here in the midst of Europe. Well, I think that we learned that we were left out in the cold. We were a small nation, nobody bothered about us, nobody looked after us except ourselves. We were in the situation of the inhabitants of Melos against the Athenians in Thucydides' story. Sure we were, and it shows us that we have to have a shelter. Small nations have to have allies, they have to have shelters. But shelters can be traps if you ally yourself with the wrong kind of superpowers or powers. And we did so actually for 500 years. We allied ourselves with the Norwegian and then the Danish king, and that really halted the economic development of Iceland. But we had good shelter, I believe, in the 20th century when we were good friends of the United Kingdom and of the United States. That was really a shelter which worked very well for us, the Atlantic card that we played. So I believe that we should not join the European Union. I'm not at all against the European Union. I think that it's a wonderful idea if people lay down their swords and cease to fight one another. And I think it may be an even better idea for the people in Central and Eastern Europe who have had experiences of very ugly powers that have overrun them. So I can very well understand that they want to strengthen their defenses against those powers. So, for example, I will not speak for Hungary, but if I were in Estonia, I would be, I think, a pro-European Union membership person. It was in Estonia. For political reasons, not for economic reasons. But then I would at the same time, if I were in the European Union, try to work for European Union being an open market, not a closed state. And those are the two tendencies that are always fighting within the European Union, and you have to fight a good fight if you are in the European Union. But for us, it is not the option I would see in the future. I would see rather the Atlantic option for us in Iceland because of our situation and because of our experience. We are all very Anglophile. And I think our great mistake was not to ally ourselves more closely with the United Kingdom before the collapse, as I said before, and we had to resume our defense cooperation with the Americans. We had a defense arrangement with them from 1941 to 2006, and somehow they just packed and left and lost interest in us. We have to try to awaken that interest and become friends with them again. That would be our foreign policy. And I would close, and this is my last slide, I would close with just one sobering thought. Life doesn't stand still. We have to do all kinds of things to adapt ourselves to new situations, and there's a challenge facing us. The big news of the 21st century, the first decade of the 21st century, isn't really the bank collapse in 2008. It is that China and India have entered world capitalism, and they pose a challenge to us, a welcome challenge, because we want them, of course, to produce themselves out of poverty, but a challenge nevertheless. And we can see this very well when you look at the fraction of world production, gross world production. Here you see the European Union, and here this is a prediction by the IMF, and then you see the United States, and then you see China and India combined. So this is the challenge that we will be facing, both us and you in Hungary and in all other countries. And I will close by, because I see here Norman Lamont, who was minister in Mrs. Thatcher's government. And I did a thesis on Hayek at Oxford University, and Hayek, he dined with us in 1985, and he told us a story about his encounter with Mrs. Thatcher, who was an admirer of his. And it was this: she got to know that Hayek was in London soon after she took power. She took power on the 5th of May, 1979, if I remember correctly. And she invited him to 10 Downing Street. And Hayek said, well, then I came there, and she greeted me at the door with saying, "Professor Hayek, I know precisely what you're going to say. You are going to say that I haven't done enough, and you are absolutely right." And Hayek said, thus she completely disarmed me. But my point is this: we are never doing enough. We have to fight the good fight, and we must never give up.
Bravo, bravo.